Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever feel like certain sounds just drive you absolutely nuts, like chewing or slurping, and you just want to escape? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating new study about misophonia, and how we can actually measure the urge to avoid those triggers. This paper is all about a new tool they developed called the Misophonic Behavioral Avoidance Test, or MBAT for short. Think of it as a really clever computer game designed to see how much people with misophonia actually avoid certain sounds, not just how much they say they do. Because as great as questionnaires are, sometimes what we do is a little different from what we say. So, what is the big deal? Misophonia is this condition where specific sounds called triggers cause really strong negative feelings and make it hard to do everyday things. People with misophonia often try to avoid these sounds. This avoidance can be helpful in the short term, but it can also become a problem in the long run. Until now, there hasn't been a really good objective way to measure this avoidance behavior. That is where the MBAT comes in. It is a computerized test that they say can measure two types of avoidance. Reactive avoidance, which is like the immediate urge to get away from a sound when you hear it. And anticipating avoidance, which is the urge to prevent hearing a sound before it even starts. And get this, they designed it to be easily used online, which is huge for studying lots of people. The researchers explain that misophonia is essentially an intense intolerance to specific sounds. People react with strong emotions and their daily lives get seriously impacted. To cope, they engage in avoidance. This can be preventing exposure by avoiding situations altogether, or reacting by escaping a situation once the trigger sound starts. While these strategies help with immediate distress, they can become unhelpful habits that actually make the misophonia worse over time. So understanding how people avoid is super important for creating effective treatments. Right now, most of what we know about misophonic avoidance comes from people filling out surveys. Instruments like the MisoQuest or the Duke Misophonia questionnaire ask about coping strategies that might include avoidance. But surveys have their limits. People might not remember perfectly, or they might not even realize how often they're avoiding things. Plus, there is always that social desirability bias wanting to sound normal. So, the big gap here was an objective, validated method to capture actual misophonic avoidance behavior. The paper talks about older methods for measuring avoidance, like behavioral avoidance tasks or BATs, which often involve gradually approaching something scary in a controlled setting. Then there are approach and avoidance tasks, or A8s, which are computerized and measure how quickly people move towards or away from emotional images. These have been used for things like anxiety. But the researchers point out that traditional BATs can be hard to set up, and A8Cs sometimes have iffy reliability and might not feel totally real. Plus, they often don't clearly separate reactive from anticipating avoidance. So, to fill this gap, the researchers developed the MBAT based on a newer theoretical idea that combines the realism of BATs with the efficiency of computerized RT measurement, which is reaction time. It has two parts. Subtest 1 is for measuring reactive avoidance. Imagine you are listening to a sound that bothers you. This part of the test measures how long you can stand to listen to it before you decide to stop it. They call this endurance time. If you stop it early, that is a sign of reactive avoidance. Subtest 2 is for anticipating avoidance. Before a potentially annoying sound plays, you get a heads up, like a text description of the sound. Then, you have to decide, do you want to hear the sound, or do you want to skip it? The time it takes you to make that decision to skip it is measured. This is all about preventing exposure. They used a bunch of actual trigger sounds, like eating sounds and breathing sounds, drawn from special databases. The whole test was designed to be run on a computer, and they even included instructions to make sure everyone was doing it in a similar way and that it was okay to avoid sounds if they felt the urge. They got over 380 adults who reported having misophonic symptoms to participate. People joined through social media and email lists. They had to meet some criteria like not having hearing loss and being in a quiet place to do the test. They did the test online, and it involved filling out surveys before and after to get a lot of information about their experiences with misophonia. To make sure the data was good, they did a few things. They asked participants about their honesty, used attention checks, and screened out people with super fast or super slow reaction times that might suggest they weren't really engaged. Besides the MBAT itself, they used a bunch of well-known questionnaires to measure different aspects of misophonia, like self-reported symptoms, how much it impacts their life, how they cope, and how they appraise threatening situations. This is important for seeing if the M, BAT's results line up with what other established measures say. They also collected data on things like how motivated people were during the test and what reasons they gave for their decisions to avoid or endure sound. They used some advanced statistical methods called Bayesian item response theory models. Now, don't worry too much about the nitty-gritty. The important thing is that these methods help them create reliable scores from the test data and figure out if the test is measuring the same thing for different groups of people, like men and women, or different age groups. This is called measurement invariance, and it is key for a good test. They also looked at correlations to see how the MBAT scores related to the scores from the questionnaires. So, who did they test? A good number of people, mostly women, with an average age in their late 30s. A lot of them met the criteria for misophonia, while a good chunk were considered subclinical, meaning they had symptoms, but maybe not full-blown disorder. Most weren't currently in treatment, and some had other issues like tinnitus or anxiety. When they looked at the data, they found that both the reactive avoidance part, how long people endured sounds, and the anticipating avoidance part, how quickly they decided to skip announced sounds, seemed to work best when treated as a single overall measure, rather than separate measures for different types of sounds like eating or breathing. This suggests there might be a general tendency to avoid sounds for these individuals. The test showed really good reliability. This means that if someone took the test again, they'd likely get similar scores, which is what you want in a trustworthy measurement. The test seemed to be particularly good at measuring avoidance in people who have moderate levels of it, which fits their target group. They did note that for people with very, very low avoidance, the test might show a ceiling effect, meaning it is hard to get a lower score. And for people with very high avoidance, there might be floor effects. Basically, it is best suited for people with noticeable avoidance tendencies. They checked if the test worked the same way for different groups. It generally did. There were some small differences, especially between age groups in how quickly people responded, but these were usually minor and didn't seem to mess with the overall measurement of avoidance. This is where it gets really interesting. They looked at how the MBAT scores compared to the self-report questionnaires. They found that the MBAT scores were related to the questionnaire scores that measured similar things, like avoiding sounds. However, the connections weren't as strong as they might have hoped for high conversion validity. For example, the endurance time measures and was only a little bit related to self-reported reactive avoidance. They also looked at how the MBAT measures related to each other and to other less related symptoms. The two MBAT measures, reactive and anticipating avoidance, were moderately correlated, meaning they capture related but still distinct things. They also found that the BAT measures were less strongly correlated with other misophonia symptoms that weren't about avoidance, which is good for showing they're specifically measuring avoidance. They explored how the MBAT fit into the bigger picture of misophonia research. They found moderate associations with things like how much misophonia affects someone's life and their perceived threat from sounds. However, some of these links weren't as strong as theory would predict. For instance, the measure of enduring sounds wasn't strongly linked to perceived threat, which was a bit unexpected. The anticipating avoidance measure, AFT, was more linked to things like expecting something bad to happen, which makes sense. They also checked if things unrelated to misophonia, like how motivated people were during the test, affected the results. They found that while motivation did play a role sometimes, it wasn't overwhelmingly strong. This suggests the test is mostly measuring actual avoidance. This is about predicting real-world behavior. They found that the MBAT measures could predict how often people reported escaping or preventing trigger sounds in their daily lives, especially for eating sounds. The effect sizes were small, meaning the MBAT wasn't a perfect predictor, but it was a consistent one. More importantly, the BAT measures were able to distinguish between people who had a clinical level of misophonia and those who had subclinical symptoms. This is a really strong indicator of the test's usefulness. Interestingly, they also looked at how fast people made the decision to avoid in the anticipating avoidance task. They called this anticipating avoidance speed, or AAVs. They found that people who tended to avoid more also tended to do so more automatically, meaning they made those decisions faster. This is a neat insight into how automatic these avoidance urges can be. So, what does it all mean? The researchers are really excited because they've created the first standardized computer test for misophonic avoidance. They say it reliably captures avoidance behavior in real time, reduces self-report biases, separates reactive and anticipating avoidance, and can be used online. They found that the single dimension for both reactive and anticipating avoidance makes sense. Suggesting a general tendency overall, they also confirmed that certain types of sounds, like eating sounds, were harder to endure and easier to avoid, which lines up with what we already suspect. Both parts of the test showed good reliability and were well targeted for people with moderate to high avoidance tendencies, making them useful for clinical populations. They also noted that the test is fair across different genders and levels of misophonia severity with only minor differences. While the correlations with self-report measures weren't consistently strong, the pattern of these correlations made sense within the broader understanding of misophonia. It suggests that the MBAT is capturing something real about avoidance that is related to, but not identical to, what people report. This is actually a good thing, as it means the M. BAT is providing new information. The fact that reactive and anticipating avoidance measures on the MBAT were moderately correlated means they capture something similar but also something different about avoidance. This is exactly what you'd hope for. However, they did notice that it was a bit tricky to separate reactive and anticipating avoidance with the self-report measures themselves. And the MBAT scores also showed some overlap. This highlights how complex avoidance can be, and how hard it is to always neatly categorize. The MBAT's ability to predict real-life avoidance behaviors and to tell the difference between clinical and subclinical misophonia is a big win. This shows the test has practical value. Of course, no study is perfect. The researchers are upfront about the limitations. One is that they use standardized sounds which might not capture the really specific personal triggers that can cause the biggest reactions for some people. Another is that doing the test online means less control over the listening environment compared to a lab. They also acknowledge that the controlled setting of the test might not fully mimic the chaos of real life, where people have more control over whether they enter or leave a trigger situation. This means the ecological validity, or how well it reflects real life, is still somewhat limited. They suggest future versions could use video or virtual reality to make it more immersive. They're really excited about the potential of this MBAT. They think it can be a valuable tool for researchers and clinicians. It can help us understand the difference between adaptive and maladaptive avoidance, and how these avoidance behaviors relate to emotional reactivity and overall severity. The AAVT, the anticipating avoidance measure, seems particularly good at predicting longer term outcomes and impairment, and that AAVs, the speed of avoidance decisions, might even help us understand if these avoidance urges are more automatic or more thought out. Overall, the MBAT sounds like a really promising step forward in understanding misophonia from a behavioral perspective. It gives us a more objective way to measure avoidance, which can help us track progress in treatments and probably lead to better interventions in the future. It is a fantastic example of how new technologies and statistical approaches can help us unlock the mysteries of challenging conditions like misophonia. So, what do I think? This study is great because it fills a real gap. Measuring avoidance behavior directly, rather than just asking about it, is crucial for understanding misophonia. The fact that it is computerized and can be used online is a huge bonus for getting more people involved in research and clinical assessment. The fact that it can distinguish between clinical and subclinical groups is a strong sign of its validity. However, as the authors rightly point out, the real-world applicability still needs more work. The artificiality of standardized sounds and the controlled environment are real limitations. Future research could explore how well this test works with individual triggers or in more immersive virtual reality settings to boost that ecological validity. Also, it would be fascinating to see how these behavioral measures change after someone undergoes a specific misophonia treatment. Think about it this way. If a therapist is helping someone with misophonia, they can now potentially use the MBAT to see if that person is actually showing less avoidance in a controlled setting. That kind of objective feedback is invaluable for treatment. What are your thoughts on misophonia and avoiding sounds? Do you experience this? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give this video a thumbs up. Subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science explained simply. And hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.